And here we are back again with our almost last session for today, which is going to be a controversy debate on public transport and the paratransit sector. Is it either or both? And to those of you who are not familiar with the format of a controversy debate, which is quite a particular session today, let me lay out to you how it works and why we want to put it on stage here. So it's actually like a theater play where we have a group of people coming together and debating as if they would take different positions. And some of them, they may have the same views they share, but some of them may just have to take this position to make clear to the public why this topic needs to be debated. And this is today brought to us by the SLOCAT and Volvo Research and Educational Foundation Young Leaders Group. So you're going to watch a theater play that was put together by those young leaders all from the African continent, and they try and explain to us why there is a need to raise awareness of this topic that is so often debated in the public and also on the ground. So let me check if we are ready to get started. I know we have some small technical issues bringing all those five in to start with the debate. Do we have a connection with everybody standing? Do we have Bianca, Fatoumata, Richard, and Tokam and Robert ready? I think we're still facing some small challenges. So let me make use of the time and remind you that we today started a new LinkedIn group. We have already, I think, above 30 members who joined by now. So you're very welcome to make use of this network, which we call the African Network on Transport and Climate Action. Please join this network and stay connected with us and amongst each other beyond Africa Today, because we did not just want to run one single conference day, but we wanted to bring you together to stay together and keep exchanging on those interesting topics. So now I would ask again if we're ready to start and kick off the debate, or yeah, I can hear something. It seems we are not ready yet, so maybe shall we go back and give our audience another networking break, or what would be the best step to take this forward? Great. So here you are. Happy to have you. I made use of the time to quickly introduce what the SLOCAT.
I can't hear you. I'm hoping you can hear me though.
Okay, can you hear me now? We can hear you. Okay, Fatoumata, you can hear me?
I can.
Great. Well, happy to have you. Well, we all know it's always a technical challenge to connect across the globe where you all are based. So maybe Fatoumata, if you want, while we're waiting for your colleagues to join the session. So you're all part of SLOCAT's Young Leaders program. Could you give us maybe an idea what this actually is, what this program is all about, and what are you doing?
Yes, quickly about the program. So we are working with the SLOCAT Partnership and the Volvo Research Educational Foundations. It was launched in May 2019. And every year, there is a new cohort of several leaders, and we're all involved in transport in some way or another. This year, all of us have a focus on the African continent, whether it's from research or us being young practitioners. We try and build an interface between knowledge and debate. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I think we lost your voice as well, Fatoumata. I'm sorry. I wanted just to ask, so normally what you're doing, I guess normally you're not only appearing in debates like we're here today, you're all doing decent research work on the ground also.
Professionnel du théâtre, vous procédez aussi à des recherches, n'est-ce pas?
We are. We come together as young professionals to put our knowledge together and either produce policy briefs or other videos of the same sort that kind of put us in situations where we all share our bits of knowledge on a given topic that is currently hot and trending in the transport.
En ce qui concerne le transport, toujours.
That's great. Thank you for being with us tonight, Fatoumata, and putting on this controversy debate with her colleagues. I hear we're still facing some technical issues, so we would ask your patience, and we will be back as soon as we can resolve. So bear with us, please, and don't miss out on this controversy debate. Thank you.
Dès que nous pourrons.
Apologies, it had to happen just once this day because as we've learned over the last 2 years, we never get through these things without some technical issues. Thank you so much for your patience. We are ready now and we are awaiting the controversy debate with our SLOCAT young leaders, and they're welcome. Bianca, Fatoumata, Robert, Richard, and Tokam, and please take over and host your controversy debate on public transport and paratransit. Let's go.
Hello, Stephanie. Well, good day to the audience. My name is Robert Ambunda, and I'm one of the SLOCAT partnerships and Volvo Research and Educational Foundation's young leaders in sustainable transport for the third cohort. The other young leaders are Fatoumata Diallo, Cabrel Tokam, Richard Unuigboje, and Bianca Ryseck, who will be the lead participants in the debate. Well, first of all, you must be wondering what the Young Leaders Program is about. The SLOCAT Partnership and the Volvo Research and Educational Foundations launched in May 2019 the Young Leaders in Sustainable Transport Program. And the aim of the program is to build bridges between the transport community, young people, as well as to explore new perspectives by creating an interface between knowledge and policy. So in that context, we are participants of the third round of the Young Leaders Program, which engages scholars with a focus on mobility in Africa. So before we get started with the controversial debate, we have prepared a poll in the chats. So please check your chats. And the poll is that within the African context, where does the future of sustainable, inclusive, and carbon-sensitive public transport lie? Is it with paratransit, which is represented by Fatoumata and Tokam, or perhaps with formal transport, represented by Bianca and Richard, or integrated transit, which is a combination of paratransit and formal public transport? Our controversial debate is themed paratransit, formal public transport, either or both, and is aimed at interrogating the relationship between the two modes of public transport and whether they can be leveraged together to improve public transport, or if they are better served operating as standalones. So for the debate, we have a scenario set in place in a city in the global south characterized by a fast-growing population and urban and income disparities. And for this city, the combined trends have led to spatial mismatches between housing and jobs, and this has caused rapid changes in travel demands. So in light of those paradoxes, two seemingly parallel economic systems have developed, which are the paratransit and the formal public transport. So as part of the city's stakeholder consultations, the city has approached representatives of paratransit operations and representatives of formal public transport to discuss and explore which operational direction would best suit the city, which is either or both. So the city has three options: to keep operations as they are at the moment, where you have paratransit and formal public transport operating separately and competing with each other, or to integrate these two public transport modes. Within that context, I would like to ask Fatoumata and Tokam, what do you think are the key roles and operational advantages of paratransit over formal public transport? And would perhaps integrating paratransit and formal public transport affect those advantages? Perhaps let's start with Fatoumata and then we'll move over to Tokam.
Thank you so much, Robert. So beginning with paratransit advantages, if we look at this from it at the standpoint of the public authorities, we can acknowledge that paratransit in many global south cities already dominates the sector, already has an expertise in providing transport services for passengers. And it's important, if we are to work sustainably, to leverage what is already there, what is already on the floor. It's also a less infrastructure-heavy mode of transportation than maybe other mass transit modes such as BRT or rail. And that can be an important argument when it comes to the ecological balance and we also need to acknowledge that these services work without any subsidy at the moment in most places, meaning that as it stands, unfortunately, as many cities are besides, they often, even in places where there is a government-run public transport service, Paratransit often offers mobility services to to population groups that are underserved by these formal services. Lastly, I just say that Paratransit has the capacity to complement scheduled transit in peak hour demand, as well as offer efficient and granular first and last mile services. Now, from the perspective of passengers, Paratransit also has a lot of advantages. I'll let Tokam take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatoumata, for your introducing word. So I think I will focus on the passenger point of view. I think actually in an African context, the paratransit mode has been organized in an adaptive and flexible way, and to ensure that the fare remains as low as possible, and then to satisfy the growing demand from passengers. And that is a very key point of the paratransit mode of transport in Africa. So this has a significant effect of the passenger choice. For example, in Nairobi, in Kenya, they have what they call matatu, and they are organized in such a way that, Kenyans used to call them super metro because the system is quite organized, and then they are able to meet the demand in Nairobi. But also one of the key points about the paratransit system is their reliability and their flexibility, and also that's push the decision from the user point of view to adopt those modes of transport. This can be seen after the result of a study carried out in Thailand, where they were able to prove that from driver and passenger perspective, they think that they prefer and they are easy to use the paratransit mode rather than the normal public transport facilities. But also there is also a point of view with respect to the path and the dependency of the route of the choice and the fare. But also in the paratransit mode, I think the passengers are quite easy to follow the mode of payment. Like in Kenya, they have what they call M-Pesa, and then it is easier to pay. And even when you don't have enough liquidity, you can lend money from M-Pesa to pay for the driver. So also the good advantage also of the paratransit mode is the accessibility, because in the paratransit system, the vehicles are able, to have access to the road, to unpaved road. But if you consider that statistic that in Africa, 63% of roads are unpaved, means that if you don't consider those kind of transport, you'll avoid the access, you block the access to various people in Africa to have access to basic service needs in Africa. So I think it's an African context. Those are the things you need to consider when you design or you plan for our transport policy. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Fatoumata, and thank you, Tokam. You've mentioned some key points there that paratransit is able to benefit very much, especially from existing road infrastructure. And it's able to serve especially the less privileged in society in terms of giving them access to jobs and other societal and economic needs. Perhaps in the same context as well, what are the key operational advantages of formal public transport in the city? And would these advantages be affected by integrating paratransit with formal public transport? This is for Bianca, and then Richard can follow suit.
I'll let Richard kick it off with the government perspective, and then I'll follow on the integration.
That's fine.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Thank you very much, Robert. Coming from the perspective of formal transport, we understand that the principles of transportation revolves around safety, affordability, reliability, safety, and efficiency. And when you talk about formal transports, it's often characterized by reliable transport routes, which often use a scheduled amount of payment systems to regulate travel. And within the context of affordability, which we'll be dwelling in our debates, we understand that the use of paratransit is quite dominant in Africa, and it's quite rampant to see that in the case of Africa, there's always an issue of urban affordability poverty, in the sense where most people who actually use public transport are actually transport poor because of the dominance of paratransit system. And going back to Curitiba, where the first BRT system was implemented, we find out that 10% of the citizens there actually spend 10% of their salaries on transportation. And if we say that paratransit is the best option, we won't be doing ourselves any good, because common transport offers the best aspects when it comes to fare regulations. And because fares are actually not regulated when it comes to paratransit, it's often a function of one's bargaining power, whereby prices generally fluctuate based on weather, based on peak periods, and even based on when there's fuel scarcity. And that gives a comparative advantage of formal public transport over paratransit. And regarding urban livability and public health, we've come to see that in the context of today's global discussion, we have ideas buzzing around sustainability and decarbonization. And we know that the best way forward is actually, investing in public transport, formal public transport that seeks to cut down on carbon emissions and also greenhouse gases. For example, we find out that in the same Curitiba, where the first BRT system was implemented, we see that there was a reduction, or it was actually ranked as one of the best or eco-friendly cities in the world in 2014 to 2016. That tells a lot that if formal transport is actually invested in, we can actually reap the best from it, especially within the context of Lagos, where we have the context that even before the introduction of the BRT, it was mostly dominated by various paratransit modes. The introduction of the BRT has reduced carbon emission by 13% and also reduced greenhouse gases by 20%. So you could see that the use of such formal transport links can actually play a role in reducing carbon emission and improving urban livability. Now, talking about the issues of equity, we realize that paratransit oftentimes do not recognize the needs of the vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups in this sense, I mean the people with disabilities and the elderly. In the case of use and design, where there's no space requirements targeted at specific gender or specific disability, whereby on formal transports like the BRTs, you see base sitting areas where spaces are being created for people who have maybe wheelchair issues or who are mobilely disenfranchised, can actually access and use it more effectively. And lastly, issues of safety and security is often something that revolves in formal transport. Like, for example, you know that you can't, transport is not transport if the safety aspect of it is not guaranteed. For me to actually say I want to use this transport, you must be able to guarantee me some certain level of safety. And in the context of paratransit systems, we see that they operate on unregulated bus stops where they just drop off and pick up passengers without adhering to traffic rules. You see two drivers who are competing at the same speed, trying to overtake each other just to pick up passengers. And that is not the case of public transport. Some public transports where drivers are trained, there are specific routes, and also there is a scheduled interface of drivers' shifts, which often reduces the risk of accidents. So I'm going to pass it on to Bianca to share more light on the impact of integration. formal transport.
Cool. Thank you, Richard. Well, I mean, what you said was quite extensive, but just to add on, like some of the other issues with integrating with paratransit, they really come down to more like regulatory and operational challenges and differences between formal and paratransit operations. So, like, for example, the paratransit tends to be more profit-oriented rather than people-oriented, which raises some serious equity issues, as Richard already touched on. So while they have like quite a bit of abundance on various points of the city, that doesn't necessarily translate into accessible public transport throughout different times of the day or for different people's needs. So for example, during off-peak times, there might be actually less transport and mobility available for certain population groups, as opposed to with formal transport, they'll adhere to certain schedules and run even during like less lucrative times of the day. And then obviously like another issue is that you get like the classic oversupply of vehicles on these super like financially attractive routes, which leads to dangerous competitive driving practices to quickly get to the passenger before another, or to even like stop, you know, like somewhere just before an intersection. Also, Richard touched upon that bit. Yeah, and then obviously there's also all sorts of like different labor discrepancies. So like, how do you fairly compensate people within the paratransit industry? So like, obviously for more formal public transport, the drivers are salaried workers, whereas paratransit workers are motivated, well, the drivers are motivated to earn a certain amount per day, which leads to those competitive driving practices. The other thing is the vehicles tend to be quite old within the paratransit industry, so they're quite heavy emissions. So like, how do we replace those vehicles? Another question, given that like in some cities you have several thousand vehicles to replace. How do you do that fairly? And then the other thing is just like in general, a lot of governments just don't have that, you know, that power to regulate the paratransit and to integrate them at all, because they might not have, you know, an integrated transport department dedicated to looking into those things. And then also, like, then there's the whole other information side of it all. So like, a lot of these systems aren't mapped. So if you want to go ahead and regulate these systems, first you have to have a base understanding of where the routes are, how much do people earn in the industry each day, so that you can fairly compensate them if you want to integrate them. And then there's also on the side the passengers. You know, you can't just leave it running so that, you know, like formal transport runs on scheduled, you know, timetables and routes. You also need to, even though paratransit still, like, there's obviously lots of advantages to that flexibility, but how do you capture that information so that passengers still understand how to move between the formal systems and their schedules to these more flexible systems and use them in an integrated way, rather than just sitting, you know, on a minibus, taxi, or BRT for their whole journey. Yeah, so that concludes our at least.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Bianca. I think you've made a good case for formal public transport, and especially around issues of safety and issues of having a more formal system with fixed timetables for clients to easily follow and to easily move between different places in the city. Perhaps just in short, this may be against the ideas that you guys are standing for at the moment. In the case of an integrated approach, as thought of by the city, are there any advantages? I'll let perhaps Fatoumata and Tokam talk on that. And are there any disadvantages as well with regards to having a system that's integrated both paratransit and both formal public transport?
Thank you. I would like to delve on two main advantages that are related to the operations. So the violent regulation modes that are characteristic of paratransit industries that were mentioned in a very clear way by Bianca can actually be mitigated within an integrated system, as there would be more support from public authorities, right? So if integration goes hand in hand with optimization of operations and fleets, there would be maybe no more daily target to reach, less unsafe driving, less violence, and better conditions for drivers, and hence a more pacified environment for passengers to actually not only tolerate but enjoy their journeys. So we can give the example of an experiment led in Cape Town with the 7th Avenue Paratransit Association in partnership with the City of Cape Town, where many of these positive side effects were noted after the city helped with the optimization of paratransit fleet. Then, and the second big advantage operation-wise is that it would increase legibility, right? It would increase monitoring, because obviously as paratransit gets integrated into the formal system, we have a better knowledge of the drivers, of the operators from the city side, and if any problem comes, for instance, any security problem, passengers can then actually report back to the city, for instance, right? Which is generally not the case in many cities that are dominated by paratransit. There are also many advantages for passengers, and I will let Tokam take it away on this one.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatoumata. I think the way we are going to tackle the problem in an African context should be different from, by the way you are going to handle the problem from an European point of view or American one, whatever you want to say. I think we should start, build from what we have in Africa. I think, because actually paratransit, you cannot ignore the role of paratransit in our transport system or in our, policy reform across various cities in the African context. For example, as an advantage for, with respect to the passenger point of view, can you imagine that if the fare is, integrated, there can be a gain from a passenger point of view, because, actually the paratransit is able to connecting the first mile to the last mile of the transport chain or the transport logistics. So those are some key points that the paratransit, the added value of the paratransit can bring on the table. But also we have the transfer time can be reduced from an integrated process. If you have an integrated approach, the transfer time from the formal transport system to the paratransit can be greatly reduced. But also in terms of multimodal journeys, you know that if you optimize, and then the times can be shorter. So for me, the best approach in an African context is to adopt the feeder-tron distributed service. I think this kind of approach is able to help the city government, to distribute the fund equitably from between the formal transport system to the integrated approach. And then also it will help also the larger truck, to deserve high volume corridor, but also to the paratransit to deserve also to respond to the demand from the edge of the cities. So I think that ignoring paratransit in the process of implementation of some transport policy in Africa is a big mistake. So I advocate for an integrated approach with respect to our African context. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Fatoumata and Tokam. Let me give a chance to Bianca and Richard just to perhaps let us know if there are any disadvantages that may keep away the African cities from implementing an integrated approach towards transit.
I guess I could start really quick. So Fatoumata and Tokam brought up some very good points, which will be tough to challenge. But yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't say disadvantages per se, but rather challenges in integrating. So like a classic example is just like how do you keep that integration working, because you have these like very cumbersome, slow like BRT buses lumbering along the main road, and obviously then you could have the attractive alternative, the paratransit, which moves much more speedily through these roads, and obviously quite a few. There's a lot more attractiveness to using that mode as opposed to the formal mode. So obviously then there's the issue that there's a business opportunity there still for paratransit to provide parallel services to the formal transport, even if you've tried integrating, which is pretty classic in Cape Town. And then there's also, like, from a passenger side, there's still the issue of, as I've mentioned before, that even if you use paratransit to act as feeder services to formalize systems, how do you make sure that that actually brings any change in equitable access to mobility? So how do you ensure that people really are driving, during off-peak times, to benefit people who aren't just doing your typical commuter trips in and out of the city? So those are 2 points. Richard probably has more to add.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bianca. So we are coming from the perspective of, if we see it as a challenge, how would this be handled within the context of upscaling it if it's to be integrated? So we noted that in the sense of it, it will be very, very difficult to actually achieve, because specifically when you say that you want to integrate efforts, sometimes these efforts can actually be met by fierce resistance, which can often, most times, render such efforts as redundant, in the sense that it doesn't actually bring the desired change, because instead of it being a form of complementarity between the formal and paratransit, it often becomes a thing of destructive competition, where this mode of transport is trying to outpace the other one to get passengers to use this particular mode of transport. Secondly, speaking concerning fierce resistance, we've come to see that sometimes, from the perspective of the public, it's actually seen as, when cases of big projects come in such a way, it's actually viewed as something that the government tries to do to move out people or to phase out certain people from the system. And in the context of it, it might actually be met with fierce resistance, where in the case of South Africa and Namibia, the government tried to integrate the formal and the informal, and from the public, from the paratransit perspective, it was viewed as a way of getting them out of the transport market. If such is actually to be done, I feel like it's going to be met with so much competition and resistance. And instead of achieving or doing what it's actually meant to do, you're actually going to see issues like strikes erupting, various civil society organizations campaigning against such acts, and the sole goal of integration would actually be defeated because of such resistance. And third, speaking about longevity, it will be difficult to maintain such integration in the long term, most especially as regards that funds would have to go a long way, especially in integration, in technology, and the likes. And lastly, within the context of social and behavioral mind change, it will be very difficult to attain such by moving people who actually depended on this particular mode of transport to actually move to another mode of transport that is quite different from them. And we all know that human beings are quite difficult to actually deal with in the context of change. And such integration might not just be possible, which might actually take time before such ideologies can properly sink into the mind of people to actually embrace an integrated mode of transport. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you for those insightful points on both modes of public transport. What I have understood from all the speakers is that in the African context, perhaps, and perhaps in the global south, our transit systems face many challenges. And to address these challenges, we need to make sure that all stakeholders in public transport are brought together in innovating and owning solutions that are inclusive and address the operational and policy reform issues around public transport. We definitely have to find solutions that leverage the advantages provided by both paratransit and formal public transport in order for us to try and provide a more human-centered, a more inclusive, and a more climate-sensitive mode of transit. So thank you very much to my fellow young leaders and my experts for the day, and we look forward to engaging all of you throughout the week. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to you, all of you, the SLOCAT young leaders, for bringing all those arguments for and against, and maybe for both, to us. It was really nice watching you debating and laying out what is in favor of combining the two systems. Thank you.